This is the 3D VIEW-MASTER adventure, The Love Bug by Walt Disney Productions. The Love Bug. The only difference between the little car of this story and the umpteen million other cars the factory made just like him was that this one wanted somebody to love him. Children and dogs already loved him, and he played with them whenever he could. But he wanted an owner to love him, and he had already picked one out. It wasn't Peter Thorndike, the snobbish car dealer who already owned him. Definitely not. Thorndike hated the little car because he wasn't a Rose or a Ferrari. The owner he did pick was Jim Douglas, a race driver down on his luck, who had been kind to him when they met in Thorndike's showroom. So he followed him home. Home being the abandoned firehouse which Jim shared with Tennessee Steinmetz, who lived on health food and Irish coffee and welded sculptural masterpieces out of old car parts. As fate would have it, Jim arrived to find that the Itzel, his sole remaining mode of transportation, had just become part of a statue. Just outside, the little car heard Jim say despairingly, "That does it. My last $50 will have to buy anything on wheels that'll get me to Bakersfield for the dirt track races." An hour later, a detective sent by Thorndike found the little car, accused Jim of stealing it, and hauled them both back to the showroom. VIEW-MASTER Reel 1. Picture 1. Thorndike, who would do anything to get rid of the little car, said, "I'll drop the charge if you'll buy this nasty little lemon." About to say he'd rather go to jail, Jim caught the pleading look the little car gave him and weakened. "Okay, you highwayman," he yelled. "Here's my last 50, and I hope you choke on it." Picture 2. "Draw up the papers, Mr. Havershaw," Thorndike commanded his number 1 flunky. "Then you can escort this broken down speed demon and his junk pile off the lot." At that moment he felt something warm and gooey and looked down with horror. The little car had squirted oil all over his $90 shoes. Picture 3. Jim soon realized the little car was unlike all others. It had a mind of its own, but he had to forgive it because it had introduced him to Carol Bennett, Thorndike's star saleswoman. On their first date, though, the car, christened Herbie by Tennessee, got over-enthusiastic and took them straight to Seabreeze Point, a well-known necking spot, and parked. Carol walked away, Jim trailing her apologetically, while Herbie trailed them both. When the police took an interest in this little procession, it was almost, but not quite, the end of a beautiful friendship. Picture 4. Tennessee, knowing machines are often smarter than people, gave Herbie a little lecture when Jim wasn't around. "You got a good boss there," he said. "So straighten up, little guy, and fly right." So well did Herbie heed this advice that in his very first race at Riverside Springs, he shoved his blunt little nose over the finish line at the head of a field of alphas, Heelys and Triumphs. Thorndike, watching with Carol, sneered, "A fluke, he'll never win another." How wrong could he get? At the Library Open at Riverside a week later, Herbie and Jim beat Thorndike and his Apollo in a photo finish. Picture 5. Again, at the Tijuana Decade Road Race, the little car raced his heart out for Jim, making Thorndyke and all the others eat his dust. Tennessee, knowing it was Herbie, not Jim, who deserved the credit, stood sadly by as his buddy showed every sign of getting a svelte head over his driving prowess. Picture 6. At last, when Jim snubbed the little car one evening, Tennessee got so upset he let his guard down when Thorndyke sneakily paid a friendly call. "Maybe I've been misjudging you," he said. "Sit down and have a shot of Irish coffee." He fired up his welding torch and began heating the coffee for his favorite drink. Thorndyke leaned against Herbie's open luggage compartment and sneakily, quietly unscrewed the gas tank cap. His plot was working so well that he chortled as he accepted a steaming glass from Tennessee. "Cheers, old boy," he said, "and may the best man win. I usually do, of course." Picture 7. Drink followed drink, and Thorndyke managed to pour snort after snort into poor Herbie's gas tank, adding a few squirts of whipped cream for good measure. With Herbie soused to the mud guards when tomorrow's big riverside race was run, Thorndyke couldn't lose. And how right he was. The track had never seen the like of it. Everything wrong that could be done, Herbie did, weaving, snorting, crashing into things, while the Apollo zoomed to easy victory. Tennessee helped Jim load his loaded car on a truck, while Thorndyke and his near posed for photos. Suddenly, from the truck came a machine gun burst of hiccups, and while cameras clicked, VIEW-MASTER Reel 2, Picture 8. Blob after gooey, blob splattered the great race winner. Wiped cream. Herbie had the last laugh. But not for long. A few days later, Jim showed up with a cocky grin and a gleaming new Ferrari. Shedding an oily tear, the heartbroken little car battered the Ferrari into a mess of junk. There was nothing to do but run away. And run away he did. But Thorndyke, who now wanted him back, put a tow truck on his trail, and before he could say Volkswagenwerke AG, there he was, back in the showroom. This he could not abide, and that very night. Picture 9. Gunning his motor, Herbie smashed his way through Thorndyke's expansive show window and dashed madly through the streets of San Francisco. Picture 10. His heedless flight took him through the empty streets of Chinatown where, not even caring, a failed to make a turn and crashed into the vegetable stall in front of the Teng Wu grocery. But he didn't even pause, for a thought had come to him, and now he had a destination. The Golden Gate Bridge. That was where people went when they wanted to end it all. So why not the grief-stricken little cars too? Picture 11. Behind Herbie, in the wreckage of the vegetable stall, Mr. Teng Wu gazed after him with oriental impassivity. Besides the store, Mr. Wu owned many things, including racing cars. Meanwhile, back at the firehouse, Tennessee had blown his cool, and with an assist from Carol hammered enough sense into Jim's svelte head that he knew he must get Herbie back. Trailing him was easy, and Jim arrived on the bridge in the nick of time. While pushing the little car back from the brink he slipped. Then Herbie's tires squealed ecstatically as he dragged Jim to safety. He was loved after all. Picture 12. Back in the groove, Jim and Herbie got set for the El Dorado race. Virginia City and back. At stake was Herbie himself. Mr. Wu was his new owner, his prize for dropping damage charges. But if Herbie won the race, Jim could buy him back for $1, while Mr. Wu took the prize money. It was the wildest race ever run. About midway, Thorndyke's Apollo barged down in a mountain stream, while Herbie made a flying leap across. Picture 13. Thorndyke and Havershoe had managed to booby-trap the whole route for the little car. But now fate did a little booby-trapping too. While Havershoe pushed the Apollo, Thorndyke acquired an uninvited co-pilot, a huge black bear with a disposition as nasty as his own. Result, chaos. Then, high up in the mother-lode country, a road sign which Havershoe had altered sent the little car plunging into an old mine shaft where there was only one way out, straight up the rickety hoist to the top of the shale pile. And Herbie was just a shade too long to fit into the hoist. Undaunted, Jim, Tennessee, and Carol wrestled the little car up until he stood on his tailpipes, grabbed the hoist ropes, and up they went. Rounding a curve far back along the road, Thorndyke gaped in amazement as he saw Herbie plunging down the mountainous side of the shale pile. The car snob's trickery had actually provided his rival with a shortcut. Picture 14. The skullduggery wasn't over, though. Before long, Thorndyke's careful sabotage began to pay off. Wheels and other essential items began to fall off the little car, and he limped across the halfway line at Virginia City last by an hour. VIEW-MASTER Reel 3, Picture 15. All night long, Jim and the others worked on the little car, aided by Mr. Wu. Herbie had further damaged himself by trying to get at Thorndyke and the Apollo after learning his foe was plotting to turn him over to a wrecking yard. Thorndyke had even kicked him, and not just on the tires either. Herbie was so burned up he kept growling to himself, and Jim told Carol, "I'm afraid he'll tear himself to pieces trying to win." Picture 16. It certainly looked that way when Herbie came snorting up to the starting line next morning. Last, of course, because Thorndyke and the others had taken off long since in the order of their finish the day before. Herbie was still growling, and in his eagerness to be off, when the flag went down, he plunged and reared like a nervous horse and shot off down the road like a runaway rocket. Picture 17. Bounding across country like a jackrabbit gone berserk, the little car overtook one after another of its rivals, until only the hated Apollo was still ahead of him. Jim's driving consisted mainly in hanging onto the wheel and praying. At the ghost town of Whiskey City, while Thorndyke threaded his way through the narrow streets, Herbie took to the back lots and came bursting through the swinging doors of the Last Chance Saloon to take the lead for the first time. But Havershoe had done his dirty work too well, and Herbie fell behind again. Thorndyke, determined to make sure of victory, stopped to roll a log across the road. Herbie struck it, bounced, and kept going, but there was an ominous cracking sound. Herbie's heart was stronger than his body, and with the finish line almost within sight, he was starting to break in two. Picture 18. "Grab your welding gun," Jim yelled, and Tennessee went into action. But as fast as he could weld on one spot, another broke open. Herbie was developing a real split personality, but still he wouldn't quit. He roared along, creeping up on the Apollo. Tennessee gave up on the welding, and all three of Herbie's crew yelled themselves hoarse, cheering on whichever half was in front at the moment. Picture 19. First, the front half, with Carol and Jim in the seat, was ahead. Then the rear with Tennessee, his welding gun still spouting blue flame like a rocket's afterburner. Up ahead, the crowd at the finish line went mad with excitement as first one half and then the other of the gallant little car pulled abreast of the roaring Apollo. Picture 20. Thorndyke was cursing. "Blast them! They're ganging up on me." "Beastly rotten sportsmanship." Herbie's front end eased over, crowding Thorndyke toward the rail. He had to brake, and in that instant Tennessee's half of the little car lurched madly across the finish line, and the flags went down. Herbie, the car who was all heart, was the winner. Picture 21. Herbie's two halves went into a joyous clinch, while Jim and Carol obliged photographers with a clinch of their own. Mr. Wu stood by, imperturbably counting his winnings in his head.